Um, many ripples over the last 18 months since, what are we to, we're coming up to 2 years, Amy, I think. Oh my God, December 17th, the anniversary of Myths of Sports Coaching. We are coming to this is the penultimate session, so we've got one more in January, and that closes off the 18 out of the 20 chapters that we were able to capture, if I'm right. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I've missed one or two there. So it's been a phenomenal experience to be able to recap with the authors their time that they've given up to give their angle, to verbalize some of the chapters. And this is a chapter that I know I've had many conversations with people, and I'm delighted to have Ali with us, Dr. Ali Bowes, this evening from Nottingham Trent Uni. Now, that won't be the only place that you've heard or seen her. Back in the day, we had the PE teacher angle of it, lecturer currently, chapters and books and documentaries that she's been part of. Those of you who are with us tonight who've watched that Netflix documentary of the unstoppable rise of women's sport, Ali at the core of that, and the research and passion that she's put into this topic. So the stepping stone, challenging the myth that women's sport is less significant than men's sport. Ali's going to take us through a 20-minute slide recap, some interesting extra angles that we might not have covered in the chapter. Always open to questions through the chat box. Amy and I'll pick those up, and then a great free-flowing conversation after that to lead us on. So I could go on with all the accolades and all the different research materials that Ali's been part of to be an instrumental movement in this area, but I will pause. Not to embarrass her too much. Ali, thanks for joining us this evening, and I hope everybody has a great session.
Thanks, Jen. Okay, so I'm just going to go straight into it, to be honest, given time restraints and stuff. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about the chapter that Jen and Amy asked me to write. And when I was looking back at it, I think we had this early conversation about this chapter in 2020. And I remember writing this in lockdown. And Jen got in touch with me and said, look, we're doing a book on myths connected to sport coaching. We'd love for you to contribute, throw an idea out at me. So what I came back with, or something that I think is important to challenge connected to this idea of myths and coaching, is the idea that, or the myth that, women's sport is less significant than men's sport. So I'm just going to talk you through, I guess, the logic of that. So the inspiration for this chapter was, at the time, Phil Neville had just left the England women's job. So for the context of, I guess, the inspiration of the chapter, and it's kind of the opening couple of paragraphs, when Phil Neville was appointed the head coach of the England women's team, it definitely raised a few eyebrows. So this is taken from, I think, maybe the Evening Standard in 2018. So he took over the England women's team at the time when we were third in the world rankings. He'd never worked in the women's game. He'd actually never kind of coached a senior elite professional team. He'd coached under 21s, worked with the 21s. He'd worked quite famously with his brother at Valencia, and coached at Man United once his playing career finished. So definitely was maybe a slightly controversial appointment, perhaps. And someone who's quite outspoken about that at the time was Rachel Yankee, who said on his appointment that she had no problem with him being appointed, but some of her concerns were around, we've got these ex-pro male footballers that are getting jobs in the women's game, and probably cognizant of the fact that perhaps that's not going to work the opposite way. I'm sure we're pretty sure that won't happen the other way. And her suspicions was that Phil Neville wouldn't hang around for too long, and would he be using that to get into the men's game and manage there? So as we all know, he left at the kind of culmination of his contract, and quite famously said that the job was a stepping stone for him towards club football, to which Farrah Williams was quite open about the fact that she felt it showed lack of respect for women's sport, for the women's game, that he was using a national team as a stepping stone was really disappointing. For him to, as you can see at the bottom, get some managerial experience, then cut his teeth in day-to-day running. So it really was kind of an entry-level job for him. For the women's game, it's the sort of pinnacle of the game. So that was my kind of inspiration for writing the chapter. And within the chapter, I give a very brief and attempted simplistic overview of I guess, the history and origins of women's involvement in sport, which many of you on the call, I'm sure, are aware of. But in short, some of the key ideas that are significant here is the notion that sport has been created by and for men, particularly in kind of UK context, in 19th century public boarding schools, where sport became formally codified, particularly sport of football. During this time, gender norms around women's bodies and restriction of femininity definitely restricted women's involvement in sport and society more broadly, to be honest. And kind of a perpetual idea that was significant at this time was pseudo-scientific knowledge around the frailty of women's bodies. So concerns about kind of exercise and strenuous activity that could damage women's reproductive capabilities, and all these kind of ideas that really impacted on how women were able to engage in physical activity. So women's organised sports then developed separately within the kind of girls' public school system, which is very upper middle class. But even as we start to see women's involvement in sport, it's well known now the restrictions that were placed on women's involvement in sport that halted or prevented their involvement. Most notably the pitch ban, the FA pitch ban in the 20s, which lasted till 1971, or another kind of nice example where you can see the restrictions of women's involvement if you just look at the history of Olympic sports and Olympic events. So the impact of history, again, a very short and simple version. The start point being the history of women's involvement in sport being really challenging, male domination of sport, which has followed through into like leadership positions. And I've kind of put like the long-term impact of that, a persistent impact of that, and then like a recent impact of that, based on where women's sport has been. So women's sport developed in isolation before being consumed by men's versions. Think of mergers, cricket, we see it in cricket, we saw it in football. And research that came out connected to coaching in America was prior to, in the American context, Title IX, when women's sport kind of existed in isolation, women coached women. And then as soon as women's sport became post Title IX, or in the context of the UK, kind of merged within the men's game and becoming taken more seriously, we start to see men more interested in coaching women's sport, given its increasing legitimization, I guess. The persistent kind of impact of that history has been the gender gap, whether that's on participation rates, media coverage, opportunities in sports science knowledge, staffing profiles, etc. And then more recently, the impact of that history on what women's sport looks like now, which is obviously very different to when we think about some of those historical points in the 70s, etc. We've now got professional women's sport, but the kind of impact of that is we still see male domination of leadership in governing bodies, etc. And those paid opportunities to coach in women's sport are then being taken up in a often sense by men. We saw, I think the Phil Neville example is a really useful example there. Now, that's not to say that this chapter in this presentation is to say that men shouldn't be coaching women's sport, because it's absolutely not. It's to challenge this idea that perhaps men have used women's sport as a stepping stone, or perhaps that the notion that women's sport has not been as valued as men's sport, and men's transition into coaching women's sport and then out of coaching in women's sport is problematized here. So I could talk about this all day, but I think some of the key points, or a couple of key points that I want to talk about, the kind of bullet points in pink, are two things that I think, based on this knowledge or what we know about the involvement of women in sport and the challenges that their involvement has seen over the last 150 years, that knowledge is really important for coaches to be aware of, to be able to start to challenge some of these conversations and be more, I guess, cognizant of the hows and the whys of the current situation. So two kind of parts to the story that I want to talk about, and that I talk about in the chapter, but I'm kind of going to update a little bit today, are perceptions of physical ability and ideas about mediatization and commercialization of sport, thinking there around this kind of professional women's sport. So perceptions of ability, and this is a really interesting area to look at, because I've written about this in the context of professional golf. been written about well, academics have written about this in a variety of ways. And what I want to draw on here for the football audience, and given the start point for this chapter was football, is debates about goalkeepers. So some of the discussions that have been had around women's football over the recent years, I guess, has been the notion that like women's football is not quite as good as men's football, or like what a shame that the goalkeepers aren't very good. And this kind of manifested itself in quite serious conversations about changing things. So changing the size of the ball, changing the size of the goal, changing the size of the pitch. And it's always been framed as a decision that's needed to maximize the difference in the capabilities of men and women. Now, I think, this is kind of my opinion on this, I think that those kind of notions are quite problematic, or are very problematic actually, because it definitely doesn't take into consideration the kind of broader context of women's involvement in the sport. So on the slide I took this from the chapter, from some work by Rachel Allison, who's written a lot about women's football in the North American context. And fundamentally, the discussion about the goalkeeper, I believe, new things popped up. The discussions about the goalkeepers, and I think it does a really good job as like a case study of some of these ideas about perceptions of physical ability, negates to take into consideration the kind of social context around, I guess, women as goalkeepers. So Siobhan Chamberlain came out, it was actually Emma Hayes who kind of, I've used the Joey Barton example in the previous image, but Emma Hayes came out in 2019, maybe 2020, and said, I think we should make the goal smaller. And Siobhan Chamberlain, who played for England, was playing for Manchester United at the time, said it was ridiculous, said it was an awful idea. And she said, as part of her career, it was only the last season that she'd had working as a full-time footballer, she had like a dedicated goalkeeper coach for her development. She said, of course, like, how are we going to have women 10 years ago at the top end of what we expect goalkeeping to look like in comparison to the men's game, because it's always compared to the men's game. How can we have that if we haven't had the resources, the access to facilities? It's well documented, the lack of training time and prioritization of academy teams and all the rest of it. That plays into these ideas about inability, I guess, of female bodies. So that's kind of my first example, really. And I think the kind of take home there is I'm not trying to articulate that men's and women's bodies are not different, or they don't have different abilities, but that when we're thinking of ability, it's not just kind of physiological characteristics of players, but it's the whole environment that comes around it. I think these kind of ideas have definitely been more popularized recently, particularly around discussions about ACL debates. We're no longer thinking women get more frequency of torn ACLs than male players because, I don't know, their knees are rubbish, or the angle of their hips, or certain biomechanical things. There's a much more wider awareness of the context in which women are taking part in sport that may lead to ACL injury. So we talk about the how kids are raised and their expectations of kids, and how they move as children, as young adults, access to activities as teenagers, and then all the stuff connected to what kind of Siobhan Chamberlain talked about in her discussion about the goals around coaching and time spent on pitch and quality of pitches and etc. So I think the awareness of that is really important in coaches being able to challenge myths, or challenge the myth that women's sport is not as important, not as good as men's sport, because you're kind of tagging on when you're working in men's sport, you're tagging on like a long history of access and inequality, I guess, for female players in that space. So that's my kind of first thing that I think is important for coaches to have an awareness of in connection to this. And the second one relates to, I guess, more thinking about the pro women's game and the pro women's game, or the elite women's game, as like the real visual representation of what women's football can and should be. So there's loads of writing on the slide, which I apologize for. But the premise here is that we look to media coverage and commercial partners, so income, revenue, sponsors, etc., as equating to the success of the women's game. So if women's football is not on TV, or isn't raising X amount of money, or isn't as successful as the men's game in monetary terms, then that is evidence of the game not being as good as the men's game. And so my kind of challenge to that idea is, again, thinking about the kind of long socio-cultural context to the mediatization of sport. So we already know that women were typically excluded, either practically via pitch bans or symbolically because of ideas around women's bodies, and women's opportunity to take part in football and sport. At this time, we start to see live sports broadcasts on TV. So the first match of the day screening was in 1964. The first football matches that were ever shown on TV were being broadcast into homes, rich people's homes, but into homes, while women were still banned from playing on football pitches. So for me, that's like a not insignificant juncture in the history of the mediatization of sport, and the significance, I guess, of that long history on women's involvement in the sport media today. Men's football had already monopolized the media landscape. TV programs were created for men's football in Match of the Day, while women were still banned from playing. So I think that's a really important kind of flag in the sand, I guess, for saying, or for almost justifying the challenge that women have had in terms of breaking into the media landscape. And that actually we need to think beyond media coverage as indicative of the value of women's sport, because they're starting from a completely different point. Men's sport kind of emerged alongside the growth of media. Women's sport is trying to carve its way into the media, and it's almost like an unfair point of comparison, I guess. So to kind of wrap up, I guess, key ideas here, the premise of what I wanted people to be able to get out of the chapter was, probably the first one is like, don't work in women's sport if you aren't going to have a good understanding of the journey of women's sport. I think that for me that's really important. That I mean I've written this in a chapter or something before, but people involved in women's sport, so athletes involved in women's sport today, are really standing on the shoulders of giants. Like there are still women today playing at a very elite level that have played for their country as full-time amateurs, working full-time jobs, managing families, etc. And that's like not insignificant information to be aware of when we then look at the product of women's sport today and what it looks like and how it's valued, and the short histories often of kind of the elite level of the women's game. And I think it's really important for coaches to be aware of that and to be able to challenge perceptions around women's sport with that knowledge in mind. I think another kind of key point for me in terms of what I was trying to get out of this chapter and what I think is really important for coaches is, I guess, to have maybe think differently about how we value women's sport, and that some of those discussions about ability, almost think it's important to think of like ability in isolation from the men's game, and actually look at kind of the growth and progression that we've seen in the women's game. That's really significant in then challenging some of these discussions about changing the size of the ball or the pitch, because these are kind of, I looked at the latest FA regulations. I think under 15s play full-size goals, full-size ball, full-size pitch. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure someone on this call knows. Yet here we are saying women perhaps aren't able to do so. So for me, there's kind of problematic assumptions that we have, like the layperson would have about women's sport, that I think could be challenged with some of that like broader historical socio-cultural context, I guess. And then perhaps the stepping stone idea could be removed if we think of women's sport on its kind of own trajectory, I guess. And then kind of wanted to finally conclude with Emma Hayes. So obviously I've kind of mentioned Emma Hayes talking about changing the size of the pitch, but and problematize that, I guess. But also, I'm sure this won't have passed many people on the call by, but the kind of discussion around Emma Hayes leaving Chelsea Women or AFC Wimbledon wanting to speak to Emma Hayes about going to work for them, and she fundamentally said like that would be a step down for me. I coach a Champions League team. I coach some of the best players in the world. Like, why would I leave that setup to go and work for a lower league men's team? And I think that's a really interesting kind of, or really useful position to take, and one to have been picked up in the media, and part of, I guess, shifting that narrative around not viewing women's sport as a stepping stone into kind of the bigger, more important, more significant men's game. So that's all I've got for you, Jen and Amy. I hope that's okay and does an okay job of kind of sharing some of the ideas from my chapter. And I think it was 20 minutes, I hope.
Perfect.
Let me just...
Thanks, Sally. Yeah, you can, if you stop sharing your screen there, we can...
How do I stop sharing my screen? Pause share? Stop share.
Okay, cool. I mean, I have loads of thoughts that I want to be selfish. I wonder if anybody, because we can unmute, I imagine, have a question or two, and if people don't, then I'm happy to jump in with some. But there's so much value in that, and I know that you've zoomed in on 2 particular areas and some great specific examples. So, does anybody have any thoughts, questions, anything sparked off? Maybe people are a bit shy.
I'll jump in.
Yeah, please jump in. Thank you.
So I work as a performance analyst with Mayo Ladies, so it's a senior football, Gaelic football team here, and we use so we have a size 4 ball as opposed to a size 5 ball in the men's game, but that's more to have more attacks, and it probably works against the goalkeeper. And just what was coming up for me from coaching both men and women, and as you said, Ali, about the goals, like I would prefer if the goals were still small size in men's at under 15 and in Gaelic football, because you're killing the self-worth of the goalkeeper by putting them into big goals and you're not able to develop them. But and I suppose what I'm thinking of all of this is you can only dance with the girls in the hall. So what you have in front of you, you have to you play with. So like Gaelic football has moved from being bulkier men to more athletic men, and we use the goalkeeper as an opportunity to develop the person that was there, to develop them better. And tweaking with the rules isn't going to, because it's a women's game, or it's because it's the team that's in front of you in the competition that you're in. And I really liked I don't know where I'm going really with that, but if it makes sense, I wouldn't discount anything. I wouldn't discount changing the size of the ball, but it has to be taken in the whole round. You know what I mean? Sorry, I don't know.
No, I do. No, I think it's a really like a nice example from a different context, to be honest. I think I was just kind of thinking through yesterday, the point I was trying to make with the goals, and I think it was quite nice to like see Siobhan Chamberlain come push back on it really, and one of the things that she said, and this only happens if you don't tinker with the rules, I guess, is like look at the quality of female goalkeepers now. Like if someone suggested on the back of the Women's World Cup in 2023 the goals are too big, I think they would have been like laughed out the stadium, because the female goalkeepers in 2023 are 3 years further on from the discussion. And I think it's really important to note that like that's really important for the development. I think I find it interesting that we have those conversations, and I know there's conversations around youth sport and the significance of changing pitch sizes and goals and stuff, but when I think like actually under 15s could be playing in the same size goals, yet here we are saying let's stick women in smaller goals, like it just feels illogical to me from the perspective of, I guess, women's football, that's the like a supposed solution to what probably has been like a problematic position for the women's game, but without like the solution is not fixing the size of the goal. It's like looking at the context of like how are we developing women as goalkeepers, and I think you can see now that the game has developed so much. Like, it's not women's physical capabilities that mean they weren't very good in goal 10 years ago. Like, it's definitely the context of or the environment of women's sport that was problematic. So yeah, I hope that is a useful response to your situation.
Thank you. No, the game I played of Gaelic football, like I said to the guys I was with this year, like I don't know the speed of the game that you're playing at now, because it has changed so much from when I was playing it, whatever, 25 years ago or 30 years ago.
Thanks, Fintan.
Thanks, Vincent. From your chapter, I think Chris has got a question, but one of the things that I found really interesting and kind of made me so much more aware was like the history. I wasn't as familiar with it until I read your chapter and kind of explaining the history and like how fashion and like schooling has dictated like women's sport. I think it makes people so much more aware of, you know, why were the playing field was never level, and I think just having that conversation has been really beneficial. Like even having that conversation with our students when we've discussed kind of gender and culture and history has been really helpful. So that's something I took from that chapter. Chris, I know you, Chris says Wi-Fi is poor, but Chris, I don't know if you can jump in it or if you want to type your question in the chat.
The absolute fear of like turning on your camera, you know, when it's been turned off and you don't know like what you're looking like.
Emma.
Oh, we see you. You're in the spotlight now, Emma.
the fear. Anyway, Ali, thank you so much for that. I could listen to you talk all day. It's so fascinating. But I just had, I suppose, a comment or a reflection. My work was with teenage girls and their engagement or lack of engagement with physical activity, and I went into my PhD with kind of the focus on how do we get girls to participate more, and I kind of came to the end of the PhD realizing that like it's not their poor fault, it's like, you know, the society that they've been brought up in, like the media, their childhood. And yeah, it's really interesting to hear. Even I didn't know that about like ACL injuries. And yeah, I just saw like someone's comment there in the chat about like how context is everything and how it's just so much bigger than like the individual's fault or the coach's fault, and it's all these historical psychosocial factors that have such a big influence in whether it's participation or actually like specific injuries. So yeah, I just think the way you tell these stories is it's brilliant, and yeah, I just really appreciate it. So that was just my comment from a different population of women and exercise. So thanks.
And just big up to you, Emma. If anyone's not read Emma's paper on the invisible sportswoman, the sex data gap in sport and exercise science research, I'd definitely.
I love it. I'm gonna like fangirl Emma right back. I love that paper. I mean, it's very sciencey for me. Obviously, there's like bits I was like, wow, there's statistics and stuff in here. But I actually just did a lecture with it with my students because I think it's so important. Even like it all connects, isn't it? So like when we look at some of the challenges that we've seen, and if we stick with women's sport and your invisible sportswoman paper, like we look at some of the challenges connected to what we know about women's bodies in sport, and then you look at your research and it's like 6%. I want to say 6%, but now I'm panicking. That's 4%.
No,
remember.
Yeah.
Is it 6%?
Yeah, 6%.
Then you see the 6%, and you're like, and you say to your students like 6%, and then you wonder why. Like there's been all these challenges, and yeah, so wonderful paper, well written. Thanks for that one.
Thanks very much. Well, we're hoping to come out with another one that's actually kind of trying to understand that figure more, and like we're talking now about maybe doing something more qualitative and looking at women who work in sports, whether it's the science side of things or the applied side of things, and like the factors that help them or hinder their progression into like those leadership roles. And then it comes back to like looking at women in football and looking at yeah, like the staff that are supporting them and the genders of those staff, and yeah, it all just kind of mixes together, doesn't it? And but I am hopeful that I do think in the last few years there has been like a push, and even though that figure 6%, you know, is small, it can only get more, can't it? It can't get much worse. So
it's a perennial story about women's sport, isn't it? It can only get better. Like, but no, very cool. Thanks, Emma, and very useful reflections on your stuff about PE as my past life as a PE teacher. Yeah, definitely. I mean, 15-year-old girls in PE is an experience sometimes, but you like fighting against the tide, to be honest. I dread to think what it's like with social media now. I was teaching 10 years ago. So yeah, thank you, Emma.
Thanks, Ellie. Emma. Caroline, did you have a question?
I had a comment. Sorry, this is Caroline Kings. I'm from We Are Girls in Sport, and Emma, we sort of try and do something similar to you, which is trying to get more girls into sport. But what I wanted to say was that, and I know I'm stating the obvious, but there is a point, is that you know, the journey of women in sport, you know, echoes women in life in general, I would say. And whilst, you know, in the business world, say there are organizations trying to get more women on boards of companies, you know, that isn't as publicized as women in sport are. And I know women in sport still have a long way to go when it comes to the media, but things like the Women's World Cup, the representation of more women in the media than there was, you know, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, is a really great way to show the teenage girls of today that, you know, we are on the rise, without wishing to sound like a bra burning feminist, you know, and because it's so visual, we see it on TV. You know, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think it's a really good vehicle, women in sport, to show girls the potential. We don't hear about the women that make boards of, you know, FTSE 100 companies, because that's just not, it's not going to appeal to teenage girls, or it's in the finance pages of the papers. Do you get what I mean? But this is really showing the emancipation of women, I think. And I know we have a long way to go, but I really feel like it's great that we're making this progress. And it just go back to my original point, that we're kind of, you know, society as a whole, this is what's going to help lift us all up.
Oh yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Sorry, Jen, you go.
No, I was just going to say, I tailed that with the really interesting piece that I read on BBC Sport today about the global revenue predicted by Deloitte. So in 22 it was 550 million, and 23 was 771 million. But they've written today, finance experts at Deloitte predict women's sport revenue to reach 1 billion in 2024. And then the forecast to generate, say, pockets for basketball and football, and looking across. So just to link to Caroline's point, really, I was blown away by that figure, and to think of the kind of massive gain that we could have. I know we're talking about football being an instrumental vehicle, but the ripple effect into other sports, and making sports in general, be it PDs or heads of or senior leadership, have those conversations about, like, what are we doing? What strategies, not just the tick box, you know, tokenistic 10, 20 grand on a program to double numbers of something. Like, how can you have like executive buy-in to shift some of the narratives? So it's really interesting figures, I think.
I actually live in the US. I'm joining today from California, and we moved here 18 months ago, and it's been really interesting for me to see how girls are involved in sport over here. And so far, to me, it seems as though they are much more. When it comes to kind of high school level, it's a common question, you know, what sport does your daughter play? I don't have a daughter, but kind of what other people are talking about. But that doesn't necessarily translate into more TV coverage, more media coverage. You know, I subscribe to the New York Times, and when you scroll down the sports section, there is even less coverage of women's sport than there is in the UK. So it's kind of interesting that there's more female sport here, I think, and it's very much more accepted that girls will be active, you know, through those teenage years, but it doesn't necessarily translate, sadly, going forwards into the media and just general TV coverage. So yeah, it's been interesting to observe both sides.
Thanks, Caroline. We got any other questions? Anita?
It's not so much a question as it's I'd just like to put an observation in, is I'm involved in a sport that is non-mainstream. So I'm not in a team sport, I'm an individual sport, I'm in shooting. And that is very traditionally, and I'm old enough also to have been involved with it for a little bit longer than some people on the call. And what I've really seen is there's a combination of things, and it's still much more recent history, is that breaking of the stereotypes, the perceptions, and that is breaking down. And during my involvement with the sport, it has done it, and the participations. But I think we're still at a slightly earlier, stage in that whole process than some other sports that are out there. But yeah, I just wanted to say that all of this is like brilliant, but it's still very much, and it's definitely a living history. But yeah, and how do we break down like some of those stereotypes, even like that transferring women from the competitor, so the elite, the very high performing competitor, into then supporting roles in the sport, and that isn't necessarily being done the best. But there's been a lot of, but in my sport, what has been brilliant is to see there's been a lot of women getting together and supporting each other, and actually standing up and saying, we are the many faces of our sport. So the more things that are done about the gender stereotyping and breaking that and developing it and encouraging the women's sport is, we need it very much. So I just wanted to comment in.
That's really cool. I think that fits really nicely with some of the stuff that I guess some of the kind of broader conversations, doesn't it, around the challenges, like this, the discussion really, I think Caroline said this goes beyond sport really, because it's actually about like how do we view women's capabilities, and lots of the things we end up talking about are just like in the context of sport, but actually these are things that we see in a whole host of settings and environments, and often it is like groups of women who come together and flag the challenges. And I think, like, if you think logically about it, like if we stick with sport, and I think this is interesting in relation to, I'll give another example, maternity rights of women footballers, that even when they're professional, maternity rights only came in 2 years ago, I think FIFA mandated maternity pay, maternity rights for players 2 years ago. And even then there's been kind of challenges for that. So the Lyon player that took Lyon to the courts for pay, she didn't get paid when she was on maternity leave. But like, of course, professional footballers didn't have maternity rights because all the people, a good number of people making decisions about the professionalization of sport and elite level professional football didn't have maternity as like a lens that they've ever had to think about before. So it's annoying on the one hand, but like it's all logical that these things like happen retrospectively when we go, oh, this actually hasn't worked for women because men have been doing this for such a long time in a sporting context. So I always find things like that quite interesting and like logical, like when you think about it, even though it's rubbish that people had to take clubs to court and that it only came in 2 years ago, but it's also like it just makes sense with the makeup of sport and the kind of journey and the challenges that have been faced along the way. So I think Anita, when you talk about the kind of issues in shooting and the development, like it will continue to develop and get better, because the women involved in sport typically like want it to get better for women, and I think they're the ones typically have been the ones that have like really had to push for change. I think players that have been really central in that in all sports.
Thanks, Anita. And Ali, I've got a question around, and sorry if you don't know the answer to this, but I do a lot of triathlon, and when we look at triathlon, the men and women get the same prize money, they compete at the same distances, because it's a more of, I guess, a modern sport, and women were involved in the development of it. Do you see across different sports kind of different representation, different kind of attention, women and men getting treated kind of differently across different sports that you've really noticed?
I think I can only answer this like anecdotally. So this is
Yeah.
not like this is just from me as like a fan of women's sport, I guess. That when sports have, I think that's a really cool example from triathlon of a sport that's kind of, and maybe it works because it's not a mainstream sport. I think the real challenge is in the sports. I'll stick with the UK context. So I think context is really key, and I think that links to some of the stuff that Caroline talks about in America. Like there's like we could talk about the lack of media coverage of women's sport in America, but like men's soccer is probably not getting any media coverage because of the Big Four and how central that is to what it means to be American. I think we have similar value placed on particularly football, but you could argue like rugby, cricket, and then that the kind of history and the significance of that to maleness and male Englishness or rugby in Wales or wherever it might be. That then becomes really hard for women to kind of carve a space, and even when they have got a space, like to be really valued on equal terms, I think is really challenging. So it's all the kind of bigger socio-cultural historical background to the sport that's quite problematic. What I can do, one of my co-supervisor PhD student who's an elite sailor, one of her projects for her PhD, super interesting. She's looking at how female sailors kind of navigate basically being a woman on the water. So the project's called Women on the Water, and the stuff, I've never been sailing, so this is so like out of my wheelhouse, but so I'll paraphrase her. Her name's Debbie Forbes, and hopefully she'll have some work published on this in the next few years. But she basically talks about that at a sailing event you can go on the water for like full days at a time over a weekend, and if you're so guys have, apparently I didn't know any of this, but guys have like P flaps on the wetsuits, but girls don't. So she's like, we're in like a competitive environment, and if I want to go to the loo, I either have to like take my whole wetsuit off, or have to get in the water and wee in my wetsuit, or there's all these kind of challenges. Then she's like, throw in like being on your period, and like this is really hard. And she talked about the challenges for teenage girls in that space, like dreading like going to sailing competitions, dropping out of sailing when they get the period, and all these things. And I'm like, oh my god, this is a sport that where women have been like added into this space, and the equipment for that, I think there's a comment in the chat about equipment, but like the stuff you need to be successful in sailing has not been designed with like women taking part in mind. Even she said that I'd never even thought of, like, she might be on the water all day, and perhaps like if there might be like menstrual blood leaking, but the inside of the boats are white. So she's like, even if you leak and you're like a teenage girl, like there's no hiding from that situation. And she said some of the mums that she'd interviewed had kind of flagged challenges with that. And I think that's just you'll find examples like that in most sports, I think, where you can look at something and go, this is something that women have been added to, and not like, you can tell they weren't there from the start. And I think that's like an interesting, something that like the sociologist in me and the feminist in me finds super interesting and like problematic. And yeah.
We found we're doing a project at the minute on like women's experiences of working in sport, and one of the main things we got, these are women working across all different range of sports, but it was like there's not even a toilet facility for women in some sports clubs. The kit that they're given is like big baggy men's kit, and someone's put like, you know, football boots that are designed for men. I know that's changing now, and there is more kind of advances in that type of technology, but that links to like Emma's paper, that if we're not doing research like on women for women, then how can we be designing, you know, the technology or the wetsuits or, you know, whatever for women. I know, like, I talk about triathlon being more equal, cycling is horrendous because that's deep rooted. That originally designed by men for men, and women were seen as not being physically able to ride a bike. I'm sure you've heard of bicycle face, the condition.
I actually had an interesting conversation the other day with a woman who works at King's in London, and her research is around I don't really want to paraphrase it because I don't think I could do justice to it, but one of her projects was around how women have adapted their clothes to be able to take part in sport, and she looked at, I think her project was called like Bikes and Bloomers, and looked at how women had like basically like had to like stitch their clothes differently so that they actually could ride a bike. You can't ride a bike in like a corset and a massive dress, whatever they used to wear in the 19th century. So yeah, I genuinely find all of that stuff so interesting. And also I think something particularly over the last few years I've become quite cognizant of, particularly how I talk about it, is like really probably, I don't know if this has come across tonight, but conscious that this is not like a man-hating, like this is all rubbish. Like it's more of an awareness, like this is how things have been, and now we need to like make the changes. And it's like not necessarily like I'm not trying to pinpoint fault on various people, because this was just like, we're a product of the broader society, right? So this is just a product of the times, and now we're in a position where we can start to make changes. And it feels like a cool thing to be able to be part of these kind of conversations where you can go, oh, I could actually, with all this reading that I did 10 years ago for my PhD, like actually people are interested in it now and people want to talk to me about it. And yeah, I think that's sort of gone a bit on a complete tangent talking about myself there, sorry, but
it's okay. And
yeah,
because we've got coaches and coach educators in the room, Ali, if you know an organization came to you and said, right, what do we need to do in our sport to educate our coaches, kind of what would be the most obvious or first thing that you might recommend?
I think it's really important for coaches working in these spaces, like for me it's like subtleties around like language. So it's how I'm having advocates in the right places. So let's take like your average community grassroots football coach. It's like challenging notions that the boys always get the best pitch, or like have we got enough facilities for girls? Have we got bins for period products and various bits? So it's like almost it's like an awareness and like a point of view level of importance. I think that you've got like people advocating for the girls programs, and that the things I've talked about today is like I guess the logic behind needing advocates for those. But actually if you wanted like a quick win for coaches, it would be like, how can we get coaches in these environments that are not women, because we know that, or are less likely to be women, because you know the challenges associated with women in coaching, that how can we get men, dads of the kids involved, like to advocate for the women's side of community clubs in the right kind of way, and that the change, like recognize where we need to start making changes, have a look at policies and practices that might be privileging men's teams over women's teams, and start to, I think it's really important that it has to be like a top-down thing. Like I think clubs have to value men's and women's arms of clubs in equal measure. So there's that. But yeah, it's very much like a worldview thing, I think. Like, can you see this from the point of view of girls? Like, if you're coming into the clubhouse, like, is it just men's teams on the walls, or is it just the men's shirts, or is it only the men's team that get the first team pitch on a whatever day? It's things like that, I think, where it's like critically thinking about. And I think all that connects to some of the stuff that even Emma was talking about around teenage girls and the bigger picture. Like if we are getting girls into these spaces, like how do we keep them there? Yeah, even little things like when I was a PE teacher, we had conversations about getting like hair dryers and hair straighteners in the girls' changing rooms. Would it make girls more likely to want to go outside and do PE? And it did, because they know that they can come in, as long as they can come in 5 minutes earlier and they quickly share the hair dryer and whatever. It's things like that where it's like, how can we make this a space that feels appropriate for women and girls, that keeps them involved?
Yeah, and like being like, why do we make girls wear certain clothing when it's not necessary?
Don't get me started on that, Amy. It's bear in mind. It's a future project, I think. Yeah, the restrictions on girls' clothes and dresses and skirts and stuff, like, let's give girls choice.
Yeah, totally. Emma, were you just about to ask a question then?
I was just gonna say, yeah, I sometimes I really struggle with like I don't know, I think you've just articulated it really well in that, like, going in with the view of what the girls need and want. I'm talking, like, you know, as like from a teenage girl's point of view, and how it is like those small nuances that actually just will make or break, like their, like when you're talking about the white painting on like the bottom of a boat, like, why would a man think of that? Like, and I totally, that is a fair like logic, but the fact that it would just, like, I'm thinking if that was me when I was 14, there's not a chance I'm getting onto that boat. So I can understand it, like, from that perspective. But also I feel like at the moment in the physiology space anyway, there just feels like there's a lot of like tension and like polarizing views on, you know, like menstrual cycle phase based training, and where sometimes I think, like, not that those things aren't important, they are, but there's so many other things that actually that we know like affect the women and the girls' experiences of taking part, let alone like that potential optimization or not. And so yeah, I just think that's a really nice way of putting it, like from the actual person's like perspective of what they need, and like it's equity, like, rather than necessarily quality, I suppose. Obviously, you know, but you know what I mean, like giving them what they need to participate fully and like reach their potential.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. A really useful example, the menstrual cycle tracking stuff. I've seen some of the debates, and some of the work that's done in this space, and as you know, like, I don't understand half of it, in terms of the physiology of it, but I understand the premise of it. And I think something I've found interesting actually, and I think it's because of, like, I'm a sociologist, so I look at things differently, but the real push for like the research into menstrual cycle stuff, when we know there's like some really big problems in women's sport in different ways. So like, is that going to solve all our problems? No. Is it really good? Yeah, like, we're learning about this stuff, but like, it all has to come together at the same time, doesn't it? So you need the other stuff, looking at like the cultural stuff, and some of the stuff that came out a few weeks ago about, like, I don't know if it explicitly is as extreme as eating disorders, but some of the stuff around like body image and controlled eating maybe, and yeah, I think there's so many bits to it, but at a real grassroots level, I think it has to be about like and it's all contextual as well. So stuff that might work in one, it's why you can't really say, I don't think you can really say to a coach like, this is going to get girls involved in football, or this is going to get girls involved in sport, because it's going to be different in different places and different cities and different access, and what this, like, has a city got a big football team or whatever it might be. But it's definitely around like, what do your teenage girls, or your primary school girls, what do they like need from this environment to make them feel like they're as valued as the boys we never have to think about these conversations about boys generally. I think obviously we could look at intersections of that, but on a general sense, like, it's easy for boys to be involved in sport and it's much more difficult for girls for a variety of ways. So how can we make that easier? That might help.
Agreed. Thanks so much, Ali. Just a couple of things before we wrap up. Graham's put some really useful resources in the chat around, put a link to the Balanced Female Health Handbook, and he said that there's some really cool things happening in New Zealand. So thanks for that, Graham. Just to sum up then, Ali, again, I'm with my coach education hat on. So it's all about considering the language that we use, the policies that we have, and the visibility and representation within our organisations. And I do think a lot of sporting organisations are making a real effort now, but I do think it's really important that they start to really look at this, you know, in more detail and more closely. Finton, thanks for that. Kyle Cox doing great work with Balance is Better in New Zealand as well. So sounds like there's some good stuff going on over there. Ali, just before we wrap up, how can people reach you if this is okay? If they've got any follow-up questions or anything else to ask?
You can reach me on my email, which is my name, ali.bowes@ntu.ac.uk, or on Twitter, to Dr. Ali at Dr. Ali Bose, I think, or LinkedIn, or just search Google me, basically. I'm sure you'll find some form of social media thing where you can connect. I didn't put anything on my slides, I don't think so. But yeah, I'm sure this won't surprise you. Love talking about this stuff. So please reach out if you do have any questions or comments, or you want to tell me I'm talking a load of rubbish. Oh, thanks, Jen. I could have just put it in the chat box, couldn't I? That's why you're the wise one. So yeah, please don't hesitate to get in touch if you want to.
And if anyone wants to,
me.
no worries. And if anyone wants to read any of Ali's work, you can catch it all on ResearchGate as well. If you go on Ali's profile, there's a whole list of her excellent chapters and articles on there. So just a big thanks, Ali. We really, really appreciate the contribution to the book and coming on tonight and sharing this discussion with us.
No, thanks for having me, Amy and Jen. You've done a great job.
No worries. And thanks everyone for joining. So we
Thanks,
have
Ali.
the last webinar, which will be happening in January, with Chris Cushion talking about reflective practice. So we will be posting about that soon. But everyone, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks, Jen, as usual, for being a top co-host. And enjoy the rest of your evening and enjoy Christmas.
Yes.
I can't believe I'm saying it.
Happy holidays.
Thank
Happy
you.
holidays.
Bye.